We are seeing more than 30 countries or so having restricted some of their food exports since the war in Ukraine began. How will this impact food prices?
Good evening and nice to see you. Look, what is happening right now is that countries are reacting to the increase in prices. As you said, the prices were the highest in history in March, according to the food price index of FAO, and in April was a very slight reduction. Now, if we look at the level of export restrictions, we have around 60 measures. If we compare this with COVID-19, we only have around 7% of the calories that move around the world with some export restrictions at the beginning, and then it immediately went to zero. If we look at the food crisis of 2008, this number went up to 17% of the share of all calories exported in the world, and then it moved lower after the crisis in 2008. And if we look at today, with the war in Ukraine, we are around 17 to 18% of calories exported being restricted. What this means is that the supply is restricted, and therefore this can put pressure in prices, and that's what we need to avoid.
How do you get out of this? I mean, you said that once supplies return to more normalized levels, the protectionist measures go away. But this time around in 2022, with the war in Ukraine ongoing, how do we get out of this?
No, look, 2022 is not a major problem right now, despite of the war in Ukraine. Why is not a problem? Because some countries have reacted and produced and export more. So the gap we have today on wheat exports, for example, is only 3 million metric tons because of the increase in exports by India and the increase in exports by the European Union. And the gap in maize is a little bit bigger, it's around 12 million metric tons because of the increase in exports of Argentina, United States, and South Africa. Because not all of what we export in the year happened after the war. The war basically restricted a gap of around 12 million metric tons in wheat and a similar number in maize. So that has been covered partially. So what we have to do to work with countries so that they avoid doing this type of restrictions is to share the information of availability of stocks and availability of food. Because we need to avoid this, and especially we need to avoid it for the next year. Because the major concern for us is the next year exports. Why? Because if the war continues and the fertilizer restrictions continues, it will not only be the exports from Ukraine and Russia Federation, which is around 30% of the cereals in the world, but it will also be a reduction in the yields of the world, of the key exporting countries, because of the lack of access to fertilizers that we are facing today.
Maximo, what about the side of things where individual countries are trying to ensure, as part of this, their food security? What's the role of China here? Because we've seen Beijing started to buy stocks of corn from Brazil, which is a very rare move. Is this going to exacerbate the broader problems?
No, what we need to understand is China is a big importer country in the world. And basically, they consume all what they produce. In cereals, they import substantial amount of cereals. They hold important stocks because of the level of supply, but the stocks in China are decentralized. So I don't see too much the problem in China, neither the problem in other countries. I think what is important today, in difference to 2007, 2008, is that in 2022, we have enough food. We have a food availability. Our major challenge is for food access, and that's because prices are too high. But in 2023, we could face a problem of food availability and food access. And what we need to do to resolve that is to make fertilizers to flow into the markets. And that means that the war needs to stop and Russia needs to allow exports of fertilizers to the world. But if that doesn't happen, we need to find ways to increase efficiencies in the use of fertilizers. One way to increase efficiencies is to reduce waste in fertilizer use, and also to find ways in which we can delay the process of application of fertilizers until this problem is resolved, meaning reducing it for 2 or 3 months so that we can resolve the war in Ukraine.
We're also seeing at the same time, it's not just the breadbasket of Europe, but the breadbasket across the US. A lot of these, crop planting states are very behind due to weather problems. In some states, they plant about 10% of crops where they'd usually be fully planted at this point in time. So if you look at geopolitics as maybe an idiosyncratic or a short, medium-term challenge, how do you deal with the challenge of climate change going forward and some of the climate-related issues?
No, that's an extremely important question because if there is any climate shock in any of the key exporting countries like Brazil, the US, or Argentina, or Paraguay, or Uruguay, we will face a substantial problem in 2023. So yes, I think the major problem right now, as I mentioned before, is that big exporting countries are trying to procure the fertilizer they need. The US is really making a significant effort in trying to find solutions, as well as other countries, and that's where we need to move, finding alternative solutions. Give you an example. Mexico, which was a net importer of fertilizers, is now using their capacity because they are a petroleum exporting country, and they are using their nitrogen to be able to produce nitrogen, which was where Russian Federation is the first exporter in the world. So we are extremely vulnerable. I will say that right now we are not in a food crisis because we have availability, we have a problem of food access, but clearly we run into a significant risk in 2023 of having a food crisis if the problem is not resolved and fertilizers don't flow very quickly.
This to me is such an interesting conversation because we were just thinking about, supplies of grains because of the war in Ukraine, because of extreme weather, but you keep pointing to the fact that fertilizers are an issue right now. Why did we get to this point, and what is next in terms of getting these supplies if you can't get it from Russia, and these are some of the main markets where we could procure these fertilizers? What can we do until we get to 2023?
So how we get to this point? No, that's the question. And the problem is that the fertilizer industry is very concentrated. There are very few countries which are key players. And Russia is one of those. It's the first exporter in the world of nitrogen, the second of phosphorus, and the third of potassium. So clearly, if something happens to Russia, like what is happening right now, they don't export, that will affect availability of fertilizers in the world. So what we need to do in the future is to try to find ways in which we can diversify access to fertilizers. For example, Nigeria can produce fertilizers. Mexico can produce fertilizers. There are countries which are petroleum, high exporters of petroleum that will have that capacity. And this is a call for action to try to avoid this problem in the future. Now, how we resolve the problem now? Let's assume that Russia keeps the export restriction and doesn't allow fertilizers to move out. The only way out is for some countries to immediately find ways to resolve this by producing, like what Mexico is doing, but also the other way is to try to find alternative ways through which you can pull out the fertilizer from Russian Federation. Luckily, Brazil was able to do some transactions and move some of the fertilizers out, but other countries are in urgent need of fertilizers. The second option is to increase efficiencies, as I mentioned before, which is basically using proper soil maps and quickly trying to reduce how you use the fertilizer so that you save and is more efficient in using. And Ethiopia has been a great example in this. And the third way is for us is to find technical solutions by commodity and by location, geographical location, on how we can delay as much as possible the highest application of chemical fertilizer by combining it with manure, with organic fertilizers, so that we can give a little bit bigger window until we can resolve the conflict. What is sad is that today the world has the food. So we have the cereals, abundant cereals in Ukraine, we have abundant fertilizers in Russian Federation, and we cannot move them out. So we need to solve this problem, but if not, we need to find alternatives in efficiency gains.